just to introduce ourselves, giving our name and our organization, and either a curiosity or an observation you have about GEO or about the body of work that Kathleen has been working on throughout her career. Before we launch into introductions, which may be somewhat random because we don't have a preset order for these, just want to remind folks that *6 is your mute code, *7 is how you unmute if you want to talk, and then Kenita just wants folks to be aware that if you have not received your binders for the May retreat, let her know ASAP, and because we really want to make sure that folks are prepared. So I'm going to stop.
Mark, one more thing.
Yep.
Just a reminder, I noted it in the email yesterday, but this is now just a conference call. Kathleen's not doing a PowerPoint, so you don't need the web portion of it.
Great. Thanks, Kenita. So I'm going to be quiet now, Kathleen, and I'm going to ask our Hall Fellows to introduce themselves. And again, it's going to be a little random at first, but I'm sure we'll find a nice way to get this done. And then Kathleen will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Mark. And I really appreciate everyone just very quickly, in a tweetable format, very quickly saying who you are and one quick idea, question, thought you bring to the conversation.
Hi, this is Susie Bowie at the Community Foundation of Sarasota County. Thank you so much for being with us. And I guess my question relates to how you have seen effective capacity building change over the time you've been working there.
Great. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tristy Sharpensay. I am from the Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Louisiana Foundation, obviously in Louisiana. And I am curious about grant-making practices that make it easier on the organizations to be more effective.
That is our sweet spot. Thank you for the question. Who's next?
This is Dwanda Moore from the Foundation for the Mid-South. And my question is, have you found social media to be effective in capacity building?
Great.
Hi, this is Nancy Claire McEnany with the R. Howard Dobbs Foundation in Atlanta. And my question is, how do you train trustees to have better discernment when they're looking at grant applications?
Hi, this is Leslie LaRue with the Community Foundation of Greater Memphis. I'm actually in development, so I'm interested in pretty much anything you have to say. But most specifically, we try to do a lot of collaboration, bringing groups together, and it's a bit of a struggle. I'm interested if you've seen particular ways that works well.
Great.
Hi, this is Amory Scott with the Scott Foundation in Opelika. It's a family foundation, and I'm interested, we said a little bit about capacity building already, but I'd like to know your ideas on getting your board more interested in capacity building.
Great.
Hi, this is Jahan Benton Clark from the Kate B. Reynolds Charitable Trust. I'm interested in learning a little bit more about how GEO's work was first perceived when you all came into the field and how you feel like that's changing.
Oh, great.
Hi, this is Laura Smith from the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation, and I'm in communications, so I'm interested in what you guys are learning about supporting strategic communications capacity for organizations.
Okay.
Hi, it's Sarah Hemingway with the Marilyn and William Charitable Foundation in Owensboro, Kentucky. I shared DeWanda's question about how effective social media can be with grant making.
This is Josh Phillipson at the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta. We're doing a lot of work right now with arts organizations and capitalization and what it means to be a well-capitalized organization. I'd love to get your perspectives on that and maybe how it applies to organizations outside of arts organizations.
Okay.
Hi, this is Debbie Cooper. I'm with the Community Foundation in Greenville, South Carolina. I am really interested in, what kind of successes you've seen with the Grantmaker collaboration on issues.
Okay.
This is Sarah Kinzer in Little Rock, Arkansas. I'm at Arkansas Community Foundation, and we have 27 affiliates who have small, unrestricted grant-making funds based for their communities. The grants are small, and so I'm wondering if you have best practices for making small grants that are effective.
Okay. I think we've got 4 or 5 others.
Hi, this is Andrew. Go ahead.
No, anyone that's out there is what I was asking, so I'm sorry.
This is Angela Moretti-Goddard with the Josie Davis Foundation in Nashville, and I'm curious about the decades-long relationships with certain organizations and how you continue a relationship without a continuous stream of infusion of funds.
So say more about that. You mean long-time grantees?
Long-time grantees, decades-long grantees that have received funding, and how do you maintain that relationship without maintaining an infusion of funds?
Okay. Okay, goodness, we need more than an hour, I think, guys. What else? There's a couple more folks. Okay, that might be everybody.
Go ahead.
Was there anybody else?
Yes, this is Sarah Manning. I'm with SunTrust Foundation and Endowment Specialty Practice. Work with several different foundations, and one particular to highlight would be the Dr. Harry J. Heeb Foundation. And I share in Sarah Kinzer's question on the small but effective grant-making practices.
Okay.
Hi, Kathleen. This is Stephanie with the Sisters of Charity Foundation, and I actually serve on the leadership team and saying hello.
Oh, hello.
And this is David Whitenauer from the Dobbs Foundation in Atlanta. I'm also on the leadership team, so I'm saying hello as well. Great questions from everybody.
Thanks, David and Stephanie and Mark, for your leadership of this fantastic group of folks. Anybody else on the line?
This is Mary Judson. I'm also a member of the leadership
Yes, Bobby Cleveland. I'm sorry, I had put it on mute. I am here.
Okay, Mary, you were saying, and then Bobby Cleveland is also on?
Yes.
Karen
Okay.
Lamb, Clayton Anderson Foundation.
Great. Well, and so folks, I kind of wanted to get everyone's voices on the phone early on so that you know that this is a conversation, and I'd love to hear you chime in with follow-up questions. And this is a great, I had a lot of different directions I could go in, but I think I'm going to concentrate a little bit more in certain areas based on your good questions. So go ahead.
One more person joined, and this is Olson Watt from the Williams Family Foundation, and I'm involved as a mentor to this program.
Oh, well, wonderful. So we've got mentors and Whole Fellows on this line and a lot of GEO members, so many of you are already probably quite exposed to our work, and it's great that you're spending this intentional time. Well, first of all, congratulations for being selected as a Whole Fellow. It's quite an amazing group of people and a wonderful program that has been just improving, and it's been so important to our sector for a lot of years now. So it's great that you're dedicating the time, and I applaud the Southeastern Council for their leadership in this kind of work. So I was asked to share a bit about GEO's story, and I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to concentrate in on the things that sound like they matter most to you guys. But before I do that, given that you're all thinking about your own career trajectory, I thought it might be helpful to share just a little bit about my own story. Very briefly, I'm one of those early folks who recognized that I wanted to have a career in the nonprofit sector and pursued my education and other experiences to try to forward that. And it came about, frankly, in college. I was intending to be a public interest attorney. I wanted to help people, and that was a mechanism for doing that I had heard about at the time. And there were two experiences in college working at nonprofits that really sparked my passion for this work. The first one actually was at the United Way of the Bluegrass in Lexington, Kentucky, which is my hometown. And frankly, the United Way of the Bluegrass is, I'm sure, a very high-performing United Way at this point. But at the time, I'm a 19-year-old intern doing some work there, and I just couldn't believe some of the opportunities that were being missed, some of the inefficiencies that were there. Frankly, I was temping re-entering in many years of donations into a database because the database had gone corrupt. So I think they call that foreshadowing for the time ahead. So that was just really troubling to me because their ineffectiveness at the time had unacceptable consequences for the community and for the nonprofits, and particularly for the folks, the poor people that ultimately those nonprofits are serving. So then I had a second experience that was on the positive side. I worked in Washington at a group called the National Network of Runaway and Youth Services. And this group was small but mighty. They were doing advocacy for young people, and they were very well led. It was a woman that I admired greatly at the helm. And it just crystallized my personal mission statement, which was that I wanted to gain the skills and experiences I needed to be a competent manager and leader inside a nonprofit organization. And that was the simple plan at the time. And then I just couldn't have been more excited and thrilled when I was in graduate school and learned about institutions like BoardSource or the Southeastern Council or GEO, that whose mission is to help improve the sector's performance and do work at the systems level. So that has been the focus of my career so far. And as Mark mentioned, I was at BoardSource before this, so I have a particular passion and interest in issues around leadership and governance. And then I was hired to GEO. Hopefully you all know that your fearless leader at the Southeastern Council, Janine Lee, is one of the co-founders of GEO, along with Barbara Kibbe at the Packard Foundation and Jim Canales at Irvine. And so they were an all-volunteer group in the early days, and when they decided to staff up a couple years in, that's when I was hired. So that's the very earliest founding story for GEO, and frankly, the thing that our founders and the earliest community had in common was that they were all capacity builders. They were thinking about how can we as grant makers make grants, support organizations in ways that improve their effectiveness. And it feels like that's a conversation that's a pretty obvious one now, but back then it was a minority practice. So I think it was, who was it, someone from Kate B. Reynolds asked the question about how we were first received and how it's changed over time. And I would say it was a small but mighty group in GEO's early history, that it was a minority of grant makers that had even begun to pay attention to capacity building as a strategy. And what happened in the very early days that has laid the foundation for all of GEO's work is that the community recognized that not only could they be making grants that are intended to help improve the effectiveness of those that they support, but there were some important changes in their own practices, in their own behavior that would unleash potential for their grantees, that might break down some of the potential barriers that had been erected. So I'm continuously reminded in my work at GEO that it's like a play within a play. We're working every day, myself, my colleagues, the GEO board, to embody best practice in leadership and effectiveness, while at the same time we're supporting our members who are trying to do the same with their grantees. And we are also frequent consumers of capacity building services, and more recently we've also been providing some grants, some small grants as part of our Scaling What Works initiative to help build the capacity of some of the funders who are recipients of Social Innovation Fund dollars. So we have a variety of vantage points on this question that have been really really helpful to continue our own learning. Now, several of you asked the question about capacity building and how grantmakers can best support that, and we'll quickly move there. I want to tell you a little bit about there were several key milestones in GEO's history that really brought into tight focus the work that we need to be doing and have been doing over the past 15 years or so. And one of them was something that we did, I guess it was 6 or 7 years ago now, called the Change Agent Project. And this was an intentional effort to go out and talk to nonprofit leaders and talk to foundation leaders across the country to try to figure out what are the practices that grant makers have the power to change, that we ourselves can change, that would unleash the greatest potential in nonprofit organizations. So what is it that philanthropy could do differently that would help nonprofits the most? And this gets to one of your questions, the woman from Blue Cross Blue Shield, about making things easier on nonprofits. So what do you think, 3 things rose to the top as being most crucial. What do you think those things were? Does anyone have an idea? Changes that grant makers can make that will help nonprofits the most.
Non-cumbersome applications.
There you go. That definitely came up. What else? Yeah, transparency. What else?
Support operating.
Yeah. Whoever said that got the #1 thing that came up was supporting giving flexible dollars.
Uncomplicated outcomes measurement, perhaps?
Oh, well, that's very sophisticated. To be frank, that did not come up very much at the time, but I think that it's sort of it has become a more present issue since we did that project. Well, so you guys hit on several of them. The number 1 and 2 things that came up both had to do with money. And I think Josh asked the question about financial capital. We heard, and nonprofits and funders agreed that we need more general operating support, that these organizations need flexible capital in order to be able to be nimble, to adapt, to invest in important things like leadership development and systems, improvement, buying the right databases, all that kind of stuff. We also heard about longer term support, so multi-year grants was the second thing that came up. So 2 of the things that came up in that situation, and they've been core to GEO's agenda over the whole course of our history, have to do with money. And then the other thing that came up that no one here mentioned, but I think you sort of hit on it a little bit with the comment about transparency, it really had to do with the relationship between grant makers and nonprofits. And everybody's heard about the power imbalance, and I feel that that's sort of a we had a guy come speak at our conference several years ago named Jerry Sternin, and he has led work that is called positive deviance. And one of his catchphrases, which I love, is to call something true but useless. and frankly, the idea of the power imbalance is true but useless because it's just always going to be there. So we were trying to dig underneath and figure out why is the relationship less productive than it could be? What's really going on there? And what we discovered, and it's actionable, which is what GEO is always looking for, is that there are just a series of gaps in worldview. So if you think about the nonprofits, the folks that are being served on the ground, they have a different set of experiences and view on the world maybe than the staffers that work inside nonprofits. And then there's also, probably a little bridge that needs to be built between nonprofit staff and those folks who serve on their boards. And then again, there's another translation that needs to be made between that whole group and you folks who work inside grant-making organizations. And then finally, there's a different set of experiences and ideas and understanding about the work between, that you hold than your board of directors. So there are 5 to 6 significant gaps that need to be traversed in order for trustees of foundations to make really good decisions on behalf of those that they're ultimately trying to serve. So this gets to the person's, the couple questions about trustees, about how you get them interested in capacity building, how you get them to make good decisions about grants. There's a lot of pre-work that is required. There's a lot of what Dick Chait in his book Governance as Leadership calls preparation for governing. It's the generative work that needs to happen before decisions need to be made so that you're making the best possible decisions. So specific examples of what that might look like, getting trustees, I'm sure many of you do this already. I know that I know specifically several of you, your organizations are really committed to this, but getting the trustees direct experience with the organizations that you're funding, direct experience with those that are ultimately being served. Not the dog and pony shows about how everything's going just great, but real straight talk about how the economic collapse affected their organizations, what the impact has been on demand, what that has meant for the strategic trade-offs that those organizations have had to make, what they've needed to put on the back burner for too many years in terms of infrastructure development that might ultimately have longer term consequences for their organizations. So those kinds of experiences can help the board and staff collectively make better decisions about grants, about capacity building support, and the like. Now I'm going to pause there and see if anyone wants to ask a question or offer up a comment.
Hi, Kathleen. This is Janine. How are you?
Hey, Janine. I'm great.
It's good to hear your voice.
You too.
Thank you for mentioning Chait's book, Governance as Leadership. And I remember when I was serving on the board for GEO, that work was absolutely fascinating and transformational in terms of the governance work that we did together. I'm wondering also, I remember the conference when we spoke about the positive deviance, and if the whole fellows wanted to learn a little bit more about that, can you point them to some writing where they could learn more about the positive deviance work, which is absolutely compelling and fascinating?
Yeah, Jerry Stern sadly has since passed away, but his work lives on. We learned about him from a Harvard Business Review article that I'm not remembering the name of right now, but if you type in Sternin and HBR, I bet you'll get it. And then there's also now something called the Positive Deviance Institute. And the premise of his work, which I think goes also a bit to sort of engagement with the community, is that he was attempting to look for assets that anyone has that would ultimately help move the issue that you're working on. So an example, he started working for CARE in Vietnam and or Save the Children, sorry, it was Save the Children in Vietnam. And they were trying to figure out why some of the kids in these poor villages were actually well nourished and others of these kids were really suffering and highly malnourished when these were kids from the same financial circumstances. Their parents were kind of in the same boat. And he led this process of inquiry with the moms, and what they discovered is that these other moms were feeding their kids more smaller meals per day, and they were also cutting up little pieces of shrimp that were native in the rice paddies into their meals, and those were the kids that were thriving. So he and his wife, Monique, basically turned around the childhood malnutrition problem in the course of 3 or 4 years. And this was based on this idea of positive deviance. The moms who were doing these other practices were, they were not the norm, but they had the same resources as everybody else. So it just opened up possibilities there. All right. So any other comments or questions about what we learned through the Change Agent project? Nothing?
Well,
I just have a question. Am I off mute? Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
You said as far as getting trustees to help, those, multiple 5 levels to get the information across, having direct experience with organizations that they're funding.
Yeah.
Can you give some concrete examples of effective ways that has been done?
Yeah, well, so GEO has led work over the past 5 or 6 years, one piece of work around stakeholder engagement. And what we mean by that is, as your board is thinking about a new strategic direction, or as they're thinking about a different way to do the work, or even a series of investments to make, that the people closest to the issues need to be consulted. They need to be engaged. And so the Blue Shield of California Foundation did this excellent participation, this initiative called California Speaks, where they got just regular citizens engaged in questions around healthcare reform. And so that helped advise them in what the strategic direction was that they were going to take, and it also enabled broader-based participation and buy-in in some of the advocacy that the organizations that they were supporting could do. So that's sort of a big example. I think many of you are already engaged in just the basics of seeking regular grantee feedback, going out and doing sort of listening sessions in an informal way with subgroups of your grantees, using your convening power to get that feedback and input. Another really concrete thing that we've found, and this is, some of you might be in the position where you are hiring other people, and at the very least most of you will be in that role at some point in your career. So every 3 years GEO does a study of foundation practice, and what we learned, we were trying to look at those grant makers that are making they are making the changes that help their grantees the most. They are giving operating support. They're minimizing their application and reporting requirements. They're more transparent. They're seeking feedback. We're trying to figure out what was different about them as compared to the rest of the field, because frankly, they were in the minority. And we discovered 2 things. One thing, which I was pleased about, is that they were GEO members, which is very nice. And that makes sense because that's the conversation that we're having at GEO. But then the second thing is that they had staff, significant staff, with nonprofit experience. So another really tangible, practical way to try to bridge those worldview gaps is to hire folks from inside the communities that you're serving, and who have raised money and tried to run programs on, without enough resources, because they bring that empathy to the conversation.
I'm so happy that you mentioned that. That's been an experience here at the Community Foundation of Sarasota County, and we just feel like even if some of the nonprofits we're serving that we cannot help with the grants they have requested, if they know that we've been in their shoes before, I think it goes miles and miles to help them understand that we're compassionate toward them and that we understand the situation they're in. So I'm really happy that you mentioned that.
Yeah, I think it's a huge shift that if all foundations prioritize hiring folks with nonprofit experience, that some of these persistent challenges that GEO has been working hard to address would go away. I think they would get a lot better. Does anyone else have a comment before we move on?
This is Josh at the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta. I have one other example of engaging board members. We use our board members to do the grant review on one of our programs, the Metropolitan Atlanta Arts Fund. They are the reviewers, so there are at least 2 board members on every site visit, and they go on at least 2 or 3, and then they're making the recommendation at the end. So staff is facilitating, driving the conversation, sometimes in those meetings, but they're full participants with questions there, and they they come out of the process at the end of a cycle or at the end of their 6 years on the board feeling like they know the arts community in Atlanta backwards and forwards. They know all the little groups that they may never have heard of before, etc. So it's a great experience. They're really tuned into what's going on after they've been there on the ground making the reviews.
That's fantastic. That sounds like a great example of just getting them the experience they need to make good decisions. Absolutely. Now,
and then they're in actual conversations with the organizations. We find that they not only are just evaluating the organizations, but they're participating in a conversation with the staff and board that they are often just sharing their knowledge that they have from the rest of their lives with the organization. So the conversation sometimes gets completely off of evaluating the organization and on to just brainstorming and making connections with other things in the community as well.
Oh, they got sparked. They want to help. It sounds like their passion is ignited to help these folks. That's fantastic to hear. Well, so one of the things Mark asked me to think about and reflect on is what are some of the lessons the GO has learned over time, and I would say that that an insight that we've come to, or I guess a reality that we're always working with, is that despite good intentions, many grant makers continue to make decisions and to engage in practices that are not in the best interest of those that they hope to serve. So why do you think that is? What do you think is going on there? Nobody sets up a foundation because they want to, make it hard on the grantees, right? That's not why you're doing the work. Well, I think one of the fundamentals is that change is hard, right? And you've always been doing something a certain way, and even if you kind of have an inkling that the way you're doing it might not be the most productive, to actually change takes leadership and effort and initiative. And there are very few external incentives for foundations to change. Community foundations a bit more than private, because you have donors and you have a lot more connectivity to the local community and frankly accountability. But with private foundations, they don't have to change, I guess, is a big part of it. What else do you think is going on there?
I think the foundation becomes institutionalized and you just get stuck in a rut.
Yep, I think that's a big part of it. And one thing we've also discovered over time is that well-meaning activities often have unintended consequences. And let me give you an example of that. I think the chaos around application and reporting requirements, people did not put in their application, they did not put those processes in place because they wanted their grantees to spend 72 hours filling the dang things out. They put them in place because they wanted to be accountable for the dollars. They wanted to make certain that they were well spent. They wanted to gather up some information that might be helpful to them. Those are all good motives, but there are often some unintended consequences to the most well-meaning decisions. Another thing that is a bit of a lesson that we've learned over time is that that's sort of similar to what I said here, is that the unsophisticated application of a good idea can also do some significant harm. And I think that there are two, this is something that I've been thinking and talking a lot about recently, because I think it pertains to both the concept of strategic philanthropy and to the concept of performance evaluation. So let's think about strategic philanthropy. Of course, it makes all kinds of sense to have a strategy and to try to think through what you want to what you want to happen and how your work is going to enable that change to happen. But I think some folks who are maybe taking a little bit more of a rigid or less sophisticated approach to strategy development think that it means just getting really niche, getting really narrow in what they're going to do. And frankly, as we all know, the kind of work that we're engaged in is not linear. It's very complex. It's multifaceted. It's about humans, and so if you decide that you're only going to focus in on this very, very, very narrow part of the equation, you've got to make certain that there are other actors that are taking up those other, the other important work, or you're certainly not going to create the change that you want to create. So that's a bit of an unsophisticated application of strategy in my view. And then the same, GEO has a deep history in evaluation. We merged with a group early in our life. It almost might have caused Janine, Lee, and I to age some additional years because it was a complex merger. But we have a core constituency of evaluators in philanthropy and a passion for using information and data to learn and grow as organizations. But the unsophisticated application of evaluation has also had some unintended consequences. And many of you, it's sort of like that hammer and nail problem, right? If you have a hammer, then everything around you becomes a nail. And I think that folks were trying to use sort of the same approach to evaluation no matter the context or circumstances, and that doesn't really work. And approaches that probably fit better for linear, more simple problems than the things, problems like trying to combat racism. That's not something that A plus B equals Z. It's just not as quick or easy to figure out.
Kathleen,
does anyone have comments? Yeah.
Well, this is Mark. Can we go back? You said something that I can't get my mind around completely. That we continue to invest in the work that we know does not have the outcomes that we want. And yes, change is hard. I think that's right. Have you seen places where foundation leadership, governance, and board and program staff have said we're going to really closely scrutinize what we're doing and ask hard questions about our own internal structure and governance and leadership as it relates to how we invest and work with organizations, and have changed practice as a result?
Absolutely. There are tons of bright spots out there.
Can you share some of those?
Well, sure. I think that there are folks who are just getting it basically right along the way, and several of you are on this phone call that I know quite well. Some examples on the topics, on the issues that GEO cares about, several Grantmakers, let's use the Weingart Foundation out in LA, they were recognizing that their grantees were just absolutely struggling, that they were getting only restricted dollars, particularly those that received government grants. Then the economic crisis hit, and these organizations were just underwater. They were not faring very well. So Weingart decided to take a little a pilot and start giving general operating support to their grantees. And there's the worry that it's less accountable. There's the worry that I don't know. There's lots of worries that I don't buy into. But they did this as a pilot, and it was so well received. It deepened their relationships with their grantees. It built trust, meaning their grantees thought, wow, they really trust us, and that made their grantees even want to become even more trustworthy. So now Weingart primarily gives, or almost exclusively gives, general operating support and capacity building support. And that was partially from looking within, but it was also about looking from without, what's going on in our community and with the organizations that we care about. Then there's also plenty of examples of folks that have used direct feedback from grantees to become more responsive, better customer service. the Center for Effective Philanthropy and others do grantee perception surveys that enable foundations to sort of track their own progress. Hey, we want to be giving world-class customer service to our grantees. We're only in the 50th percentile. That means we're squarely average. We want to be best in class. So they could make some changes and do some work and then take another look a couple years down the road. One foundation that gets that really, really right is the Grable Foundation in Pittsburgh. Their CEO was the chair of the GEO board for a while, and he talks about he instructs or encourages his colleagues to try to give customer service on the caliber of the Ritz-Carlton or Nordstrom. So they don't want to just do the basics like returning people's phone calls, which also is doesn't always happen to the rate that we all wish it would. But they want those folks to know that they are at their service, and that's a different way of framing it. But it's a huge bright spot. So Mark, when I said that at first, what I was referring to is that most folks would understand at this point that nonprofit organizations need reliable capital, they need flexible capital, they need support over the long term in order to be strong. And at the same time, Grantmakers aren't given much, but the operating support has stayed static over the course of the past decade, and multi-year support has gone down since the economic crisis. So if you ask a foundation leader, do you think nonprofits need need flexible capital or need to support appropriate investments in their infrastructure? Yes is absolutely the answer, I would guess, for the vast majority. But then what is your particular foundation doing to embrace that belief? Those two things don't always line up.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Sure. Did anyone else want to interject with a question or a comment?
I had a comment that I think is at the bottom line of the issue, some of the issue about change, and I can't own this, but I read it somewhere and it really resonated with me. And it's really that bottom line, particularly private foundations have very little accountability other than spending the required 5%. And so I think sometimes it's easy, as someone earlier said, to get into a rut of grant making and thinking we are able to give grants where we think they're best needed, but that level of accountability, unless you really take it upon yourselves as a foundation to do the perception surveys and things, I think that there's little impetus for us to do that.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And what I'll add to that is that, interestingly enough, what we've learned over time is that top-down solutions, foundations just deciding what they think is right and doing it, don't work. So it's in your it's in your own best interest in furthering your mission and trying to achieve what you hope to achieve, to be more connected, to work more closely with your nonprofit partners, with other funders who have generated insights over time on the issue that you care about, than it is to just have a wise idea that you believe is going to work. Even if you have the right idea, the process is part of any solution, right? Like engaging with folks, talking about things. That is the momentum builder. That's how you get more folks moving in the direction that you all want to go. So I completely agree that leadership in philanthropy, that's why leadership is so profound and so important, because a competitor coming in and taking building a similar product, that's what motivates some corporations to change, or other shareholders, stock prices going down or other things like that. In philanthropy, much of the motivators are internally driven. It's because there's a board, there's a key staff leader, a CEO or other, who is willing to say, we want to be held accountable for better performance than this. This is not acceptable. And they create the urgency and they create the internal will to get something like that going. And that is, it's a little bit more rare than I wish it would, but I wish it would be. But it's incredibly powerful. And you can tell those organizations, and frankly, one of the true pleasures of my role is that I get to work with those foundations, with many foundations who are unsatisfied with the status quo. They are unsatisfied with the pace of progress on the issues they care about, and they're self-motivated to do something differently and to try to continue to ask the questions about what could, how is it what we're doing working? What could we change? What do we need to know that we don't know now to make better decisions? And they go after that. Well, so several people wanted to hear about capacity building, and there's lots of good information on the GEO website, but I just want to say a couple things briefly that hopefully will cover your questions. GEO has just taken back up capacity building in a very significant way. We have always cared about it. We've looked at it directly and indirectly over many years. And we're going to continue to make the case that these are very important investments for foundations to make. In terms of good capacity building that actually builds organizational performance, we've learned so there are 3 characteristics to good capacity building. And that is that capacity building considers context. So you're not just plunking down a capacity building workshop for all of your grantees when that's not a monolithic group. They are diverse. They have different needs. And so providing capacity building that's targeted to the particular context of those specific organizations. Also, capacity building has to be continuous. It needs to be ongoing over time. It's not like a 3-month project to build capacity. There might be a particular issue that needs some intentional focus over several months, but the idea of being a high-performing organization and staying a high-performing organization is something that needs to be continually attended to, and therefore foundations just need to think through what the implications of that might be for their own grant making. And then the other thing is that capacity is best built when it's collective, meaning that more than just one or 2 people in the organization are involved, that it is the board is bought in, leadership and staff are bought in, and they're working together on it. So that collective, continuous, and contextual framework is an insight that GEO has come to about good capacity building. And where we're headed on capacity building, which is just very exciting, we've been very focused on, we're called Grantmakers for Effective Organizations, as a matter of fact. So we've been worried about organizational effectiveness over much of our history. And where we're headed, at least with the capacity building work, is to look at what it takes to build collaborate, the muscles to collaborate inside individual institutions, and then also how do you build the capacity of networks, of movements, of cross-organizational collaborations, because that is a different it's a different kind of investment, and it needs to be considered. The metrics around it need to be different. The way that you go about that work needs to be quite intentional. So over the next several years, GEO is going to be focused on capacity building for collaboration and capacity building for multi-organizational efforts. Does anyone have a question or thought on that? All right, well, we've only got about 10 minutes left, and I'm looking down the list of other questions that people had. I think Laura asked the question about strategic communications capacity. I've seen several really smart and good approaches that foundations have taken to supporting grantee communications. That's one of those things where the money's not there, it just doesn't get invested in. So I think providing flexible dollars is one way to support strategic communications capacity so that folks have the money to apply to it. But in terms of maybe a cohort-based approach to supporting communications, several national foundations, Packard, Hewlett, and others have worked with Spitfire strategies to send groups of their grantees through a strategic communications training that I've heard really good things about. Andy Goodman, who's a guy who is really great about telling your story and does workshops and webinars for foundations and for GEO, in fact. He can really help get folks thinking in a way to help them emotionally connect with those that they're trying to connect with. So those are a couple ways that foundations have been supporting strategic communications capacity in their grantees. I'm just looking at the time, and what I wanted to do, I was asked to give you sort of practical advice for your career, and and also some of the trends and implications of GEO's work for you and for leaders of foundations over the next couple decades. And one thing I'll just say about that is that we all know that our individual resources are just not big enough to address the problems that we're trying to address in our own communities. And so there's a big opportunity here to combine our resources with one another, with other foundations, and to work in a more direct and strategic way with the grantees that we serve. We've talked about the fact that change, whatever kind it is, will only sustain if the people with the most stake in the issue and the experience on the ground are involved in identifying what the issues are and both discovering and implementing those solutions. So it's just in all of our best interest to shift from any concept of us and them, us the grant makers, them the nonprofits, to we. And I think that FSG has done really important work talking about collective impact as an approach to bringing all of the actors to the table to try to move an issue. But I'll say that there's a philosophical shift that needs to happen in order for us to really take on important work and make progress that is sustainable over time. And that philosophical shift is to I feel like this is so self-evident that I shouldn't even say it, but it's really hard to live, and that is to put the work first. So to put the mission, to put the thing you're trying to achieve ahead of, even organizational needs or your personal, your organizational brand. Or individuals' egos, because if the work is really what's driving action, then some of the things that get in the way around grant cycles being off, so it's hard to coordinate work, or differing evaluation protocols or what have you, that all that stuff just kind of tends to melt away. So that's one piece of, I guess one insight that I'd leave you with. The second one, and this is an insight from Ami Dar, who's the founder of Idealist. He spoke at a GEO conference a bunch of years ago now, maybe it was 2008, and his observation is one that I've seen as well. But what he said was, I spend all this time in the offices of major foundations, and one thing I've noticed is that you never see anybody walking quickly. So nobody's in a hurry. He said that these places seem more like museums or libraries. People are talking in hushed tones. But it's not like a campaign headquarters or a place where the work seems to be moving very, very quickly. So another charge I'd issue to you is to see what you can do to help create a sense of urgency to solve the problems that your foundation is working on. Because that, the time is now for us to make some serious progress in this work. And then the one final thing, and then I'll just leave a couple minutes at the end for all of you to make any final comments or ask one last question. The one final thing I'll say that I think is the best advice I can give to any grant maker is to lead with questions and deep listening rather than advice or suggestions. Because you don't really know what's going on with a nonprofit or in any particular situation until you've taken the time and you've given them the gift of listening to them. And then there might be a suggestion that you have, but too often many program officers, many grant makers lead with advice and suggestions, and I think it leads to a better relationship and a deeper understanding of each other's work if you flip that and start with being really curious.
So Kathleen, that's extraordinary. We have about 2 or 3 minutes left, and I just wanted to ask the fellows themselves, leadership team members, and some of the mentors if there's any last question that they would like to, or comment they'd like to share with you.
Any final insight? Now I noticed I didn't get to the social media questions, so I'm sorry about that. I'd be happy to talk to any of you offline if that would be helpful.
So Kathleen, can we share your email address with folks on this
Sure,
call?
Of course, absolutely. My email address is on the website, and it's just enright@geofunders.org. And I'd be pleased to be helpful to you as part of your leadership development process, or if there's any specific way that GEO can help in your own work, just definitely give us a call.
So Kathleen, on behalf of Southeastern Council on Foundations, the Hall Fellows, and the leadership team members and mentors, a big thank you for an extraordinary session. I'm really struck by your closing thoughts about listening attentively and deeply in urgency, and those are issues that I think all of us need to ask ourselves more. I also want to give a shout out to Janine Lee, who, her engagement with GEO, as you acknowledged, was so important, and how lucky we are that she's bringing that spirit and practice and commitment to leadership to our region. So with that, Kathleen, so many thanks, and I look forward to future conversations between you and the Hall Fellows and between you and the leadership team.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Janine, for your leadership, and it was great to meet you all, and I hope to meet you in person at some point in the future.
This was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Please stand by.